Cops are always the good guys. So I watched tonight the recently released onto HBO Max Denzel Washington, Rami Malek, and Jared Leto co-starring film The Little Things. It is it's billed as a psychological thriller. It is a police procedural film. It has Denzel Washington as a former detective, now just working as a sheriff's deputy. He seems to have been, knocked down. Things went rough for him at some previous point in his career. He, through just some stuff, general administrative stuff that he has to do, he finds himself in a different precinct and coming across a precinct where he used to work and coming across open case being currently worked by Rami Malek, and they end up stumbling upon eventually Jared Leto as their prime suspect, and it goes from there. Now, this movie it came so close to doing something that would have been really bold, I think, especially now. And it didn't completely fail to do it, but I think it accidentally stumbled into relevance, and I don't think that John Lee Hancock, who wrote and directed it, really understood what it was he had created. And to really dive into that, I am going to have to get into spoilers. What I will say as a general rule prior to that is that my review of this is it's too long, first off. You should shave about 20 minutes from it. And there aren't even like full scenes you have to excise. It's very slow. It's got kind of Zodiac pacing at times. So if you just trim some scenes here and there, you can easily shave 10, 15, 20 minutes off this thing, and it would run better for it. And it's a pretty bog standard. In some ways, honestly, it feels kind of outdated. It feels very late 90s, early 2000s. Not that like the visual techniques or anything around it, but like this kind of film, even with Denzel Washington, and actually even especially with Denzel Washington, I just kept getting flashbacks to Fallen, which was a late 90s police procedural movie with Denzel Washington, which was better than this because it had an interesting twist to it. But, it feels of an old time in a way that isn't like, ooh, retro fun, but more like you don't seem to realize that this is out of date, which again, looking into the behind the scenes a little bit, kind of makes sense because the script was originally written in 1993. And this would have been pretty groundbreaking in 1993. And I suspect it got updated very, very, very little because it's a period piece set in the early 90s. So I have a suspicion that there was little to no updating of the script that ever went on while John Lee Hancock was shopping it around before eventually deciding to direct the thing himself, which I think is probably what contributed to the fact that he didn't really realize what he had, because what he wrote has a very different significance now than it did then. I don't think he appreciated that. Again, I'll have to get into spoilers to explain that. But broadly speaking, it feels a bit like an outdated cop thriller, in the vein of Seven or, I mentioned Fallen or any of a bajillion of those types of movies. So it feels like that until about the last 20 minutes when it does something interesting, but then doesn't really sink its teeth into what it did. It doesn't totally bungle what it did, but it takes way too long to get to the part that's interesting, and then that interesting thing feels underutilized. That's kind of my broad spectrum on that. So from here, I'm going to go into spoilers because the most interesting conversation to be had about this film is all spoilers. So the way that this pans out is that it's Denzel Washington initially kind of latches onto the idea of Jared Leto as the killer. And Jared Leto is playing an absolute creep. top to bottom, like, this guy is sketchy, he's weird, he is antagonistic towards the police, he seems to be practically announcing that he did this stuff, but there are also kind of holes in things. You know, he's antagonistic to the point that it's like, how is this guy racked up this high a body count, you know, serial killer body count, and not been caught yet if he's this flagrant about it? And it gets realized that he had actually confessed to a murder a few years before, but they let him go when they realized there was literally no possible way that he could have done it. He knew a bunch of details, but he wasn't within 50 miles. And your assumption, if you're used to this genre, is, well, he found some way to trick, you know, and have an airtight alibi, and that's a con. The thing is, it's not. So, and again, this guy is completely creepy, and he more or less lures Rami Malek out into the desert, and, you know, on the claim that I'll show you where I buried a body, and he's having Rami Malek just dig holes, and he keeps going like, oh, well, maybe it was over there, maybe it was over. He's toying with him, he's messing with him, and Rami Malek is finding nothing. And eventually Jared Leto needles him to the point that Rami Malek just turns around, whacks him with the shovel, and it kills him. And so now Rami Malek has killed someone that, you know, in his mind, like, he's so certain, like, this was the guy. Well, Denzel shows up and sees this, and that's when we get the flashback to why Denzel Washington isn't a cop in this precinct anymore. Because he was working a similar case, and they had come across, you know, these two. It was dark, it was night. They come across these two bodies, and they're looking through the woods looking for clues, and somebody jumps out, and he shoots them, and it was another girl. It was a third girl who had gotten away. He shot an innocent woman. And we learn in this flashback that the rest of the precinct covered it up. They marked her down as a third victim, and they completely covered it up. And it seemed to, it recontextualizes all of his interactions with the people who he'd worked with before, as you now understand what it was that had gone on between them. But he shows up and he basically tells Rami Malek, all right, here's what you're going to do. No one's going to come looking for this guy. You won't get caught. And the thing is, the tone and the vibe of the thing is very melancholy. Again, 7 feels like a good comparison. This idea of, you know, maybe the problem with these cops was they were too invested, they cared too much. I'm not going to say that the film goes so far as to feel like it lets them off the hook, but it's framing all of this in this low-key melancholy fashion. And I can't help but see this and think to myself, what you have here is potentially a biting rebuke of the stereotype of the cop who has to bend or break the rules to get justice, which is a trope that at this point, given, you know, what I now as an adult know about how police conduct themselves, especially when they break and disregard the rules, that should not be put forward as entertainment. It should not be put forward as righteous. You have in this film potentially a harsh rebuke of that trope, of that genre trope, and at the same time a potential to explore the fraternities of silence, because this is a big part of the problem with issues within any police force. They have a fraternity. They watch each other's backs. They don't turn each other in. So even if you're going to make the case of a few bad apples, they don't get rid of those bad apples. They protect them. They make sure that they don't ever face the consequences of what it is they did. And I'm watching that happen here. I'm watching the backstory of Denzel's character and finding out that they protected him. And now, this guy who already accidentally killed an innocent person has now enabled and pushed another younger cop in the same direction, brought him into his mentality, and now that cop has killed an innocent person. An insanely creepy person. Make no mistake. But by the very end of the film, there is no ambiguity to this. There is zero actual, true evidence that Jared Leto did anything illegal. And all the evidence points to is a creepy guy who gets off on looking up the details of murders and was on a power trip being a suspect. Super creepy guy. Didn't kill anybody. There is no evidence that he did. And the film does do a decent job of not having that be ambiguous. That, at least it did. And that's kind of what I mean by, it doesn't completely bungle this. But for a film that has this, again, on paper, sharp rebuke of a, at best problematic, at this point, I would say outright damaging trope, combined with digging into the way that cops protect their own, but only dealing with both in the last 20 minutes of a 2-hour movie as opposed to actually exploring those ideas and digging into what they mean. That's what I mean when I say I feel like John Lee Hancock did not know what he had. I think he had just been shopping around the same script since the early 90s. And in the early 90s, this would have played, again, tonally very similar to Seven. A police procedural, psychological thriller thing with a melancholy and off-putting ending. But now, in this climate, those scenarios, those actions, those depictions take on different meanings, and I feel like he didn't appreciate that, or didn't understand it, or didn't recognize it. Because nothing about the way it's executed feels like much more than just a melancholy twist. It could have been so much more. On paper, I like what happens, but nothing about the way it is actually delivered on screen, to me, says that he understood why this would have mattered now in a different way. Which is a shame. And it's ultimately why it's a movie that I'm just gonna shrug off and go, I wish it had done its ultimate sort of tail end justice, because the build up prior to that is pretty generic. It is Seven. It is The Bone Collector. It is a half dozen other existing Denzel Washington movies, and it's fine for that. It's outdated, but it's fine. Then it gets to the last 20 minutes and it does something interesting, but then doesn't do enough with that, and it's a shame. And I hope that another movie at some point might explore these ideas, the acknowledgement of the danger of the cop on the edge, as opposed to treating them like the hero always. Acknowledging that these people are dangerous and, even fictional. Like, a cop on the edge? We should be scared shitless of that. But it's a hero trope. And again, I hope at some point I can see a movie that recognizes that takes what this movie did and understands what that means to do it. Because I don't think this one got there. The Little Things. Did you see it? What'd you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Like, share, subscribe. I have a Patreon. That's how I afford HBO Max and how I was able to watch this movie at all. And, even if you're not able to do that, like, share, subscribe. All that helps. But you don't have to do any of it. Because at the end of the day, I take a relaxed attitude around here. So you can just come on back next time you need a break.